It's great to welcome to the program today Stanley McChrystal, retired United States Army general and also author of the very interesting book, Risk: A User's Guide. I really appreciate your time today. It's great to have you on.
Well, it's my pleasure, David. Thank you.
So, you talk in the book about how we all have a sort of immune system to deal with risk that evaluates risk and is sort of in an iterative way analyzing what are acceptable and unacceptable levels of risk in life. Can you talk a little bit about how the system operates, how it's developed, where it comes from?
Absolutely. As we started studying for the book, we first came to the conclusion that the greatest risk to us is, in fact, us. And we came upon the analogy to the human immune system. And the human immune system is a miracle. It basically detects threats that are ingested by our bodies, analyzes each one for their threat to us, responds, normally destroys them if necessary, and then learns from that process. And that's the principle behind vaccination. And it does that about 10,000 times a day, they estimate, on things that could make us sick or kill us. And yet we don't have to spend much time thinking about it unless the immune system doesn't work. Well, organizations and actually individuals have what we call a risk immune system. And that's a series of 10 risk control factors like communication, narrative, action, timing, leadership, things that form a holistic ability to respond. And what this really says is we can't predict every risk or threat that's going to approach us. We're just not that good, and in a complex world, it's a fool's errand to try. But what we can do is make ourselves more resilient, make our organizations better able to respond to those things that come at us from every direction and of unexpected form.
I want to kind of build up to big organizations like the military and large corporations, but maybe we could start just with an example at the individual level. I remember when I was 18, I got a motorcycle and my parents didn't like it, but I think they thought if they tell me get rid of it, it'll make me want the motorcycle more. So I think it was sort of like a let him get it out of his system thing. And I had an experience where I hit a little bump, the front wheel came down and the handlebars started getting a little squirrely. And at that point, it was a fraction of a second where I said, this is beyond my risk tolerance. I realized it's too dangerous and I got rid of it. Now, that one instant decision, I'm guessing, is coming cumulatively at the end of a whole bunch of different inputs over the course of my life up to that point that allows me to intuitively assess that the risk here now exceeds the reward. How does that system get built up over time?
Well, over time, you first learn the ability to know what's important to you. Typically, when you're about 18, when I had a motorcycle as well, I was interested in being cool and going places and not spending a lot of money to do that. And so that became a very high priority for me. And I was able to sort of compartment away the idea that I would set the bike down and get scraped up, which I did, and other things like that. And so you start with prioritizing what's important. And then as experience comes, you also learn that things can happen. In the military, people talk about new soldiers being scared in combat. Well, the reality is every brand new soldier thinks they're bulletproof until they realize they are not. So it is older, more experienced soldiers, in fact, that have a better appreciation for what the dangers of combat can bring, and they tend to be more cautious. They tend to do more things to prepare effectively, to wear body armor, to do all those things. So we learn through a lifetime what's important to us, what we've got to protect, and then we also learn what are the things we have to do to put in place protections. In some cases, it's modify our behavior. In other cases, it's use different equipment, have a car, not a motorcycle, things like that.
When it comes to the military, it seems that there's this additional component that has to fit into the risk calculation, which is that elected officials who are outside of the military make decisions about what they want the military to be doing. So, I mean, thinking about Iraq as an example, we could do an assessment of the kind of risks of that mission from a strategic and tactical standpoint. that doesn't really seem to account for the political motivations that exist in even thinking of doing that in the first place. So how does an organization like the military, where risk assessment is so important, deal with the fact that much of what is being done is politically oriented?
Well, you hit a good one here David, because these things are often at tension. You may have policymakers who want to accomplish something and they're prepared to accept great risk to the force so they can do that because they think that the overarching objective is important. And as long as everybody is informed and aligned on that, then you can operate pretty well. The problem is when you have them in tensions, like in Mogadishu in 1993, there was this mission creep. And the force on the ground thought that their mission was to get Farah Hadid. They did a number of operations. The risks grew higher. And then when it ended up on the night of 3-4 October 1993 with the big firefight in which 18 Americans were killed, policymakers recoiled because suddenly that level of loss was a domestic political risk that they weren't prepared to accept. And so what had happened is you can find people can wander away from being focused and aligned on the real risks to something, and then unexpected outcomes produce really difficult circumstances.
Did you have situations where you were analyzing a situation or a mission from a risk standpoint in the way that the military does it, and then when you present it to an elected official, you realize that you guys just are not on the same page, that the risk assessment, the way you're doing it, is disconnected from their political priorities?
Well, in fact, and often their political priorities aren't perfectly aligned in their own minds because they just haven't thought through it enough. So, for example, during the war in Afghanistan, there was a great concern over American casualties. And I absolutely get that. The people that you're serving with, you don't want them injured or killed. At the same time, a policymaker may be saying the important thing is to prevent any American casualties. Well, you can't accomplish the mission if you don't accept some level of risk. I go to the loss of Ambassador Chris Stevens in North Africa a few years ago, and there was this call that Chris Stevens should not have been in Benghazi, should not have been at a location where he could be at risk. Well, I would argue, if you don't want him at risk, put him in Ohio. The problem is there's a different risk. He won't accomplish any diplomatic objectives. So you've got to understand what the overall requirement is and then temper your risks according to that. And too often we have policymakers, people on the ground, and different players not aligned with a common understanding of what the actual mission is and what the risks involved are.
How could those things be better aligned? Because it seems fundamental to the way that a military operates, which is the military operates in one way, whereas their missions are often guided by different considerations, and it creates this conflict that you're talking about, or this incongruency maybe. Is there some way that it could be organized differently so that those are better aligned?
Well, first is communication, and of course, a clear narrative provided by leadership. You know, and the military's not clean on this. It's not like the military's got it right and other people don't.
Sure.
If you give military people a requirement, often they will say, well, the thing that is least risky to us is to use massive fire support, pummel the area, go in and occupy, and that reduces the risk to our soldiers, and we will accomplish the overall mission. But if in doing so, you alienate the population, or you create popular resentment around the world to what you do, then what you've done is you've actually lost the big objective by trying to reduce risks at the local level. In Afghanistan, we had a period going into an area in Helmand where the local commander used a term called courageous restraint. We are going to have our soldiers operate in a way that's actually riskier for them, their personal safety, but it's more aligned with what we have to do to win the support of the Afghan people. And that's where this communication has to occur. Because policymakers can see soldiers out accepting risk and they go, no, I don't want them to accept risk. When in reality, you got to be focused on what's going to produce the most important outcome, the overall mission that you're there for.
In the midst of these missions, sometimes we hear that, not that it's easy, but that it's typical that individual service members will say, I'm not here because I decided that this is the mission we should be doing. I'm here, I'm a cog in the wheel, or I'm doing my part, and there's, a chain of command, et cetera. And the political considerations are not important. But then in the later years of the Iraq War in particular, as I remember it vividly, we started to hear more stories from people coming back and saying, when we were there, we were talking about, if this was their opinion, why are we even here? Iraq didn't do 9/11. I don't understand what we're doing. And that started to become a factor for some, not for all. Obviously, many believe that we should have been there. Can you talk a little bit about how common that is and how it impacts service members to be on a mission that they may think is not one that should be even on the table?
I think it's very common in almost every war. And it comes partly from a misalignment on what the actual mission is. And there's also comes when the frustration if you don't think you're accomplishing it. Many people don't understand that in 1864, President Abraham Lincoln thought that he was going to lose re-election. And he thought he was going to lose re-election because people in the North had soured on the war, and particularly in the Eastern theater, they had not seen a tremendous amount of success. And so frustration, soldiers were saying, I am fighting in a war that we are not winning, and therefore I'm not accomplishing anything. And so that happened in Afghanistan, that happened in Iraq. You also see things that, with your Iraqi partners or Afghans, you see corruption or a lack of effectiveness, and you become cynical. You go, why am I here doing my best and risking my life when in fact the people who we are theoretically helping aren't doing an equal amount? That's age old. You'll never do away with that. You do try to address it so that soldiers understand, but then you also try to make sure soldiers understand the overall purpose of their mission. It's really important for commanders and political leaders to constantly explain to soldiers, why are they doing this? If I think of soldiers in the Philippines in early 1942, as the Japanese were moving to conquer it, which resulted in the Bataan Death March, many of them felt that they'd been abandoned and there was no point in trying to defend something that was indefensible. And it gets down to communication and leadership.
When it came to Afghanistan, because this is an area that you know well, and the recent withdrawal that President Joe Biden carried out, my perspective was when Donald Trump proposed it, I liked the idea. And when Joe Biden did it, I liked the idea. And my belief is that the problems that took place would have taken place no matter when it was done. And that fundamentally, as you talk about the big picture versus the nitty gritty, it was the right thing to do. Do you have thoughts about how it went, given that you spent so much time there?
Yeah, I'm probably more forgiving on the actual problems at the end than some people might be. And the first reason is when President Trump did the Doha Accords and agreed that Americans would leave by 1 May 2021, he was ending the forever war. And that was what the consensus of the American people really wanted to have happen.
Yes.
And so the next 18 months, the Taliban didn't attack Americans because it wasn't in their interest. They just wanted us to leave. The danger was from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who had a reason to want to attack us on the way out. So as this small American force, it was down to about 2,500 people, when it came time to reduce that force and begin the actual withdrawal, you're going to have increasing risk as it gets smaller because less ability to defend yourself. Now, of course, the question is, why couldn't the government of Afghanistan maintain legitimacy and its military maintain coherence during that process? Well, what I would say is, the Afghan government struggled with legitimacy from the beginning, partly by their own fault and partly for factors, but also the Taliban did a really good information warfare campaign so that right after the Doha Accords were signed, for 18 months, they went around the country and they said, as soon as the Americans leave, we're going to flip power here. And so no rational Afghan official or military wants to be the last person killed in a losing cause. So the Taliban didn't conquer Afghanistan, they occupied it, when the air went out of the balloon. I know that we say it's an intelligence failure by American intelligence community or military not to know that was going to happen. And I would say this is more art than science. It was hard. So I don't think it was went like we wanted it to. I don't think the overall outcome certainly doesn't make anybody happy. But I don't think it was the fiasco that is sometimes described. There were risks involved, and people knew that.
Do you think it would have been just as chaotic had Donald Trump stuck to his original timeline?
Yeah, I think the risk of it would have been there. I don't think that would have changed the risk of that. You can't guarantee it would have happened, but I don't see any reason to believe it would have been different.
Fair. I guess we should talk a little bit about organizations and corporations when we talk about risk, just to go back to the start of our conversation. We've talked about individuals in the military. It seems one of the unique things about the idea of a corporation is that the corporation is a legal entity, it's an idea, but it's made up of individuals. And because of the size of some very large corporations, as well as a kind of imbalanced risk reward for the individuals, where they could make a decision that has the potential to make them a lot of money, but has relatively little downside, because at the end of the day, there is this apparatus called an S corporation or a C corporation that exists there. Does that skew risk calculation for large corporations? And could it be a factor in these situations where you hear about big corporations doing bad things, whether they are environmentally or legally or whatever the case may be?
I think it can. I don't think it always does that, but if we forget that corporations have a responsibility as an entity, think of them as a huge person, they still have a responsibility for their conduct and for things that they do. But there is this idea that if you're in the herd and you're doing something you know is wrong, it's like being at a big social event and everybody starts acting stupid. You know, they're drinking too much or they're rushing the stage or whatever they're doing. There's this ability to think you are anonymous in the crowd. And sometimes you are incentivized to make a lot of money. I think during the roll up to the real estate crisis, 2008, there were a lot of people who knew things were not good, but yet they are making a lot of money at the moment. And they go, well, I'm just a small entity in a big thing. And what's the chance that the big thing is going to collapse? And of course, the reality is the big thing is made up a lot of small things, so it can collapse. So I think there's a moral licensing there. There's a moral hazard that you can think you don't have the same level of responsibility because of that, since you're just a cog in the large wheel.
The book is fascinating. It's called Risk, a User's Guide. We've been speaking with the author, Stanley McChrystal, retired United States Army general. I so appreciate your time today. I really do.
David, thanks very much for the conversation.